It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the weekly podcast Film Seizure that you can catch every Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week, it's going to be the first chapter of a long 22-part journey that we're going to take together over the course of what probably will be years for this show. We're going to get into the world of Carl Kolchak, as played by Darren Mcgavin. This first television film from January 1972, The Night Stalker, would go on to become the ABC television series Kolchak, The Night Stalker by 1974. But here, we will start with his humble beginnings. This was originally based on an unpublished novel by writer Geoff Rice called The Kolchak Papers, also known as the Kolchak Tapes. Rice always wanted to write a vampire story, but wanted it to be set in Las Vegas. The lead character, Carl Kolchak, is an investigative reporter that tends to basically annoy everyone around him, but Rice couldn't find someone to publish the novel, but his agent thought that maybe this would make for a better movie than a book. So eventually, the story was sold to ABC, and after the TV movie would go on to become the most watched TV movie of the week of its time, Rice did eventually get his book, that's now retitled The Night Stalker, published. His sequel, which we will get to down the road a little bit, The Night Strangler, would go on to also become a book written by Rice. However, it was not an original story, it was based on the teleplay that was written for that sequel. This teleplay for The Night Stalker would be written by Richard Matheson. Now, we've touched on him before. He was writer of the novel I Am Legend that got turned into 3 movies ultimately, but the one that we've covered on this show is The Omega Man. You seen it? It's beauty. If you got that reference, you are A1 in my book. But anyway, he also wrote the script for The Devil Rides Out, which I also covered back in Hammer Halloween just this past year. He also did a ton of TV scripts for series like The Twilight Zone, Star Trek, The Martian Chronicles, and Amazing Stories. So he's done a bunch. He's also done a bunch of novels that were eventually turned into movies, such as The Incredible Shrinking Man, which also means that it was the basis of the sort of remake, The Incredible Shrinking Woman. He also wrote the novel that would be turned into A Stir of Echoes, What Dreams May Come, as well as Somewhere in Time. Now, you may notice that Matheson didn't necessarily stick to one genre. Sure, he did some horror, he did some thrillers, but he also did some sci-fi, he did drama and melodrama as well. And he just was a great writer and still pretty influential to this day. The director for this TV movie was John Llewellyn Moxey, who was born in Argentina but mostly worked in British and U.S. film productions. He did a film called The City of the Dead in 1960, which also goes by the title Horror Hotel, that stars the great Christopher Lee, and it's about witches and curses and so on and so forth. However, where he really made his mark was in TV. There were several big hit TV shows in both the UK and US that he did episodes for, like The Saint, Hawaii Five-0, Mission Impossible, Kung Fu, Miami Vice, Magnum P.I., and Murder, She Wrote. But there are also 2 more things that he directed that's worth noting. The first is the pilot episode of Charlie's Angels, and that's not insignificant because, well, as we all know, that became a decades-long franchise in its own right. But also he directed the TV movie Genesis 2 in 1973, and that was Gene Roddenberry's first shot at a trio of new sci-fi shows to follow his cult success of Star Trek. Genesis 2 is basically about a post-apocalypse that a guy who's been put into suspended animation wakes up to after the civilization was destroyed. Roddenberry had like 20 more episode stories written out to help turn it into a TV series, but CBS ultimately declined and instead picked up the Planet of the Apes series that didn't last long anyway. If you are an avid fan of Star Trek, I would recommend looking into Genesis 2 and its history. You may find that there are some aesthetics that would ultimately work its way into Star Trek the Motion Picture later in the 70s. But enough of that, back to Kolchak. Our lead is Darren Mcgavin. Now, McGavin's career went back to the 40s, and by the time that he got the role as Kolchak for the Night Stalker, he had already racked up dozens of credits. McGavin was mostly a character actor who wasn't so much a leading man all that often, but often a great supporting member of the cast. Outside of Kolchak, most people my age would likely know him best from two things. First, as the dad in the 1995 Adam Sandler hit comedy Billy Madison. Second, as the dad in the cult favorite Christmas film, A Christmas Story. Those are probably his biggest roles for the Gen X crowd, unless you happen to know about Kolchak like I did. However, beyond that, sure, he was in Raw Deal with Arnold Schwarzenegger and the black comedy Dead Heat, but he really wasn't that big of a star. That said, he would typically stand out when you did see him in something. Interestingly, but also totally expected, McGavin also appeared in a couple of episodes of the hit series The X-Files. Why is that expected? Well, that's because Chris Carter, the creator of The X-Files, cited Kolchak as a heavy influence on his show. And to be honest with you, I also wanted Kolchak to serve as an inspiration to either a comic book or a series of novels or something of a supernatural / sci-fi type Monster of the Week style series that I wanted to do once upon a time. And I really wanted to kind of pitch it as a blend of Kolchak and Doctor Who, but with a cheeky sense of light humor like the Buffy the Vampire Slayer series. Oh well, maybe in another dimension or universe I ended up writing those books, but let's get on with it for The Night Stalker. The movie opens with McGavin's Kolchak in kind of a sleazy, dirty motel room, listening to his own tape of what would become his story of a manhunt that took place, as he says, between May 16th and May 28th. He says two important things. First, it will be the last time he will ever talk of the events of this case. And second, much of the facts of this case were suppressed in order to keep some people, including political types, from facing backlash. He goes on to tell the story of a petite blonde who was meant to be meeting a friend on the evening of Sunday, May 16th. But instead of meeting up with that friend, this blonde ended up walking home alone and was killed viciously by an assailant with an unexpected amount of strength. The woman was completely drained of her blood. And 2 days later, Kolchak was called back from the first vacation that he had in years, he says. And he believes that his editor, Tony Vincenzo, called him in because he was the only one who could cover this type of sensational story, though it's probably entirely possible that Vincenzo's claim that all the other reporters were busy with other stories might actually be the truth. But Kolchak's girlfriend, Gail, was a friend of this woman who was killed, or at least knew her somewhat well. And Gail talked about how this woman was trained in karate to defend herself and was relatively solitary. So it's unlikely that this was somebody that she knew or someone who could really get the jump on her. A second girl is found that same day. The body, much like the first, is completely drained of almost all of her blood. And interestingly, there appears to be two other facts about this finding. This girl's blood loss did not happen where her body was found, and there are no footprints around her body. Kolchak reports on seemingly the seemingly connected nature of both of these deaths, and the fact that the second body might have been either carried to where she was found or flung there. The bizarre details discovered by his story really pisses his editor off because they don't know that they're connected at that stage. Then a third body is found. This time, a woman is killed, drained of her blood, and stashed in her closet without her roommate hearing a single sound of the struggle. A pattern was beginning to form with 3 murders in 3 days, and now no one is talking to Kolchak anymore. It proves that this is not just a series of unconnected crimes, but probably a serial murder. Kolchak uses his connections at the hospital and the FBI to try to get access to more information about the bodies and about the case. But it's getting hard for him to get really what he needs, as people are being very, very secretive about a lot of this stuff. But he does get invited to a press conference, and the coroner explains that there is some sort of a bite that seems to be similar to what might be caused by a dog, and the blood was sucked out with great force. And around the bite marks on these women, saliva was found. Human saliva. So Kolchak asks if the bites were caused by someone who had the expressed intent to drink the blood of the victims. And while everybody kind of laughs or seems exasperated, kind of over whatever Kolchak always tries to sell as far as sensationalism, the coroner says that it could actually be possible. He thinks that maybe their murderer is possibly anemic. Someone did see a tall, dark, pale man who was poking around the storage warehouse where a bunch of blood and plasma was stolen overnight. And the district attorney tells Kolchak that despite the coroner saying that his vampire theory should not necessarily be dismissed out of hand, he does need to kind of not publish the story about a vampire. He can't create a panic with stories of monsters running around town. Everyone is sworn to secrecy, and the DA threatens Kolchak that he could make life hard on him. And on top of that, his editor, Vincenzo, is especially not interested in publishing anything Kolchak turns in that alludes to a vampire actually running loose in Vegas. Kolchak gets a call from that another body is found, and this time the murderer was witnessed by this victim's mother. This leads Kolchak getting an exclusive look at the police drawing of the man's face. Shortly after, we get to see something more of him than just his back or his silhouette. He has bloodshot eyes and very pale skin, something like you'd see from Christopher Lee's Dracula. He attacks a fifth woman, killing the Doberman that the woman uses to protect herself, and she seems to have gone missing. Vincenzo is not convinced that this missing person is a fifth victim connected to the others, but Kolchak knows that Vincenzo is also helping suppress the information based on the wishes of the DA and the authorities. At home, Gail convinces Kolchak to read a book about vampires. She says that based on everything he's told her about this case, the killer's done most of what's in the book. And he learns about how common the lore of vampires are throughout human history. He also learns about how vampires are scared and will retreat from the image of a cross and can be destroyed when they're in their weakest state during the day. He learns that a vampire's victims will rise as vampires themselves and must be destroyed the same way as our main vampire, with a wooden stake through the heart. As he reads about that, our vampire shows up at the older hospital in town to steal blood from their storage. Kolchak learns from the police radio about the brawl that broke out from security trying to stop the man, and he arrives just in time to get a picture. Kolchak then has published the story about the brawl, and then later he learns the name of the killer, Janos Skorzeny, and he was born in Austria in 1899. So this man is supposedly in his 70s at this point. Now, when Skorzeny arrived in England around the time of the London Blitz, he cared for the injured, but also had very bizarre stuff in his flat. He had large tubs and a large meat freezer. While it doesn't necessarily prove that he's a vampire, it is true wherever he goes all over the world in his travels, unexplained deaths follow him, and he is indeed an international fugitive. Kolchak raises the question of how many times this man was shot by the sheriff's own men at point blank at the hospital, and it didn't even slow him down. He says they really do need to hunt this guy as if he really is a vampire. This nearly gets Kolchak laughed out of the room, but he begins to question whether or not, one, the police is hushing everything to prevent from being thought of as incompetent, and 2, if they will actually catch this killer. Now, Kolchak starts stalking the streets at night to find Skorzeny. Skorzeny is cornered and captured, seemingly, by the police, and Kolchak is there to cover it. And he sees this supposedly 70-plus-year-old man overpower about a half dozen cops and escape. After interviewing all the cops present, finally Kolchak gets to be heard about dealing with an actual vampire. Kolchak says each man in the field should carry a cross, a stake, and a mallet to hammer said stake into Skorzeny's chest. He also says they need to shut down the night patrols. It's not really going to do them any good. They need to follow him to wherever it is he sleeps during the day and then deal with him then. Kolchak is granted conditional full and exclusive rights to the story after the media blackout is lifted. However, if he is wrong, and this is not a vampire, he is to basically beat Cheeks out of town within 12 hours. Kolchak thinks that he has the world on a platter with the story that he'll be able to publish, and that he'll get to return to New York, which is one of the places he's been previously run out of for being an annoying reporter. Now, Kolchak finds out from one of his contacts about where Skorzeny has been living. He decides to go check it out before telling the cops because he knows they will not wait until dawn if they found out about the place. He finds the stolen blood from the hospitals and the blood banks, and he finds a coffin with a bunch of dirt in it. And he also finds a bunch of disguises that Skorzeny has been using. He also finds the 5th woman who has been reported as missing. She's tied to a bed with a nasty wound on her neck, but she's still alive. As he tries freeing her, Skorzeny comes home, and Kolchak waits for his chance to jump Skorzeny, but is found instead, and Kolchak defends himself with a cross, which allows him to get away for the moment, but he is ultimately tackled by Skorzeny and is nearly bitten himself until he is saved by his FBI friend. The fight goes on long enough for the sun to have risen outside, and Kolchak brings down a curtain, and it weakens the vampire, giving them the chance to destroy the monster. Kolchak writes his story and proposes to Gale, thinking that everything is going to be wine and roses now. But, he'll be, winning awards, and he'll be able to pick whatever job he wants in whatever city. But Kolchak gets called to the DA's office. His editor finally admits that, indeed, he is one hell of a reporter, but it's a little bit somber. When Kolchak arrives at the DA's office, there is a warrant for his arrest on charges of first-degree murder waiting for him. Because you see, just as Kolchak was delivering the killing blow on the stake, the sheriff witnessed what was going on. So to get out of the murder rap, the DA has rewritten the article and tells Kolchak to leave town. They've also gotten rid of Gale by sending her out of town for being, as they called, an undesirable element. Kolchak ultimately exhausts his savings to try to find Gale, but to no avail. He has written a book about the events, and it will be impossible to verify the accounts of his story. Everyone involved is either in hiding, not talking, or dead. Skorzeny's file in Washington has been scrubbed of his real name and all of his aliases that he's used over the decades. His body and those of his victims have been cremated as soon as possible because, as Kolchak put it, the legend goes that a victim of a vampire will return again as a vampire. Now let's get to my 3 things that I like about the Night Stalker. First, I absolutely adore the mood and tone of the Kolchak series as a whole, and it starts right here with this first TV movie. There is a classic feel to this whole setup and story. It's a little bit film noir. It's a little bit of classic monster. However, it's also very modern. I'll talk more about Darren Mcgavin later, but there's this swagger to this premise that with the right idea for how to present this almost 40s style sleazy reporter and kind of cheating cop trap that the reporter falls into at the end, that you're really seeing present day noir. However, it's not so much bad guys or decent fellas and dames with a little bit of dirt on their faces. but it's about the common man basically being steamrolled by the politics and how this extraordinary crime is sort of covered up to keep reputations secured. It's very much of its time. If done today, I'm guessing Kolchak would be some sort of a conspiracy website guy who knows the truth but being silenced by big tech or something stupid. That feels overworked and overly winking towards the goofballs that think that they know more than the rest of us. This, while still of its time and kind of quaint in its simplicity, is much more timeless. It's the story of the little guy who is tenacious and smart and truly trying to inform the people. But like I said, he's being utterly steamrolled by the big man. It's perfect. Now, second, this little 75-minute TV movie has a fantastic cast. Not only do you have the established actor Darren Mcgavin, but you also have Carol Lindley, who's playing his girlfriend, who has been working since the 50s and was in a huge string of stuff since the mid-60s at this point. She worked a ton and on a lot of really popular TV shows. And she was also in the very same year in the Poseidon Adventure. And that was a huge hit that got nominated for several Oscars. Vincenzo was played by Simon Oakland, who had all sorts of big-time credits, including Psycho, West Side Story, and Bullet. Kolchak's FBI pal, Bernie Jinx, was played by veteran actor Ralph Meeker. Of course, you can't do anything in the 70s without Elisha Cook Jr. showing up in a bit part. Claude Akins plays the sheriff and was all over TV and movies in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The point I'm trying to make here is that this is not some cast filled with nobodies below Mcgavin's name. They are all veterans and specifically and perfectly cast to type. This is a large cast of lots of recognizable folks, all able to contribute something to this movie. It's a little surprising that something this short can support not just the fairly detailed plot, but also its heavy cast. Somehow it does all of this extremely well. But thirdly, this is Darren Mcgavin at his best. He's sardonic and a little bit sleazy, but he's right. He has this old school tenaciousness about reporting the facts because people have the right to know what's going on around them. That's such a common thing in this era that this movie came out in. This kind of mistrust of authority and that knowledge is power in the public, even if it's potentially dangerous and could cause mass hysteria. He's the type of, he's the type that the knowledge is hands down more important than the potential fallout. That the fallout will create something better because the knowledge is so key. Darren Mcgavin has this voice and demeanor that is just perfect for this type of role. And that's really on display with his voiceover as he recounts this incredible story that shook him up pretty bad, as it turns out. He's squirrely and looks more like a used car salesman in a cheap suit than a top reporter. And he's easy to be dismissed as a bum and an annoyance. That's great casting. There was an attempt at a remake of the series in the early 2000s, but I can't possibly imagine any attempt to be made to recreate this character without someone sort of grizzled and middle-aged with a rough voice and kind of down on his luck. It would take something pitch perfect or somehow even more special than this to outdo Mcgavin. Now, in a couple of months, like I said, I will be doing the sequel to this movie, the second Kolchak TV movie called The Night Strangler. Then, a little bit later on, I'll start going into each individual episode. And I wanted to do something like this with serial shows for a couple of reasons. Kolchak, the Twilight Zone, Night Gallery, The Outer Limits, and The X-Files all have significant places in monster entertainment. I want to touch upon those just as I do feature-length movies. It also gives me a chance to have a slightly lighter episode mixed into the various weeks that I do this. I do this every week. And anytime that I may need a little bit of an easier and breezier episode, there's an opportunity. There is also another Monster of the Week type show, and a pretty darn significant one that comes from the BBC, and I wouldn't be surprised that you already know what I'm talking about because I did mention that earlier. That will also start making its appearance on the show this year, but those are more feature-length itself. Overall, I just wanted to be able to do more of the TV-based stuff for Monster Mondays because I do think that they have a pretty significant place in all of the stuff that I typically talk about already. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com, but don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Join me back here in 7 days as we put the wraps on February and talk about a classic sci-fi thriller that literally features brains that suck out the intelligence of people in Fiend Without a Face. Until next week, stay spooky.